London, December 1812. The ballroom at Finchley House blazed with the light of 500 candles, their golden glow reflected by crystal chandeliers and the jewels adorning the throats of every woman of consequence. The scent of hothouse roses mingled with expensive perfumes, and the sharp tang of mulled wine that servants carried on silver trays through the crush of bodies. Florence Jane Bancroft stood near the refreshment table, her emerald silk gown carefully chosen to complement her fuller figure rather than apologize for it, and wondered how many more Christmas balls she would have to endure before society simply forgot she existed. At 24 years old, Florence had survived 3 complete seasons without securing even a whisper of a serious proposal. The whispers followed her instead, soft and cutting as winter wind. Poor Miss Bancroft. Such a pity about her figure. At least her father's textile fortune makes her considerable enough for a match. She had learned to hold her head high through it all, smiling pleasantly while society matrons calculated her worth in pounds sterling rather than personal qualities, long accustomed to the cruel assessments of her appearance that followed her from drawing room to ballroom. What none of them knew was that while they counted dance partners and assessed potential matches, Florence spent her evenings in her father's study calculating import duties and profit margins with a precision that would have shocked them silent. The notebook tucked discreetly in her reticule held figures that could make or break merchant fortunes, but to admit such unfeminine interests would only add to her list of unmarriageable qualities. If stories of love that sees beyond society's cruel judgments touch your heart, please subscribe now. You will not want to miss what happens when a brilliant mind meets the one man brave enough to value it. The evening had reached that point where the dancing had grown more spirited and the conversations louder, when propriety began to soften at the edges like candle wax left too long near flame. Florence had just accepted a small glass of ratafia, its sweet almond scent heavy in the air, from a passing servant when the collision occurred. Jonathan Charles Blackwood, the younger son of Viscount Blackwood, had been attempting to navigate through the crowd, while simultaneously avoiding the calculating gaze of Lady Rutherford and her marriageable daughter. He did not see the elaborate floral arrangement on its pedestal until his shoulder connected solidly with the base. The crystal vase tipped, sending water and winter roses cascading directly toward the refreshment table. Florence jumped back with surprising agility for a woman in evening dress, but her reticule was not so fortunate. The small beaded bag flew from her wrist, landing open on the polished floor. Papers scattered across the marble like autumn leaves, revealing neat columns of figures and calculations that had no place in a ballroom. "Good God, I'm terribly sorry," Jonathan said, dropping immediately to his knees to help gather the scattered papers. His hands, Florence noticed with a start, bore the telltale calluses of manual labor, an oddity for a gentleman of his rank. He reached for one of the sheets, his eyes scanning the content before he could stop himself. "These are import duty calculations for Scottish wool." Florence felt heat flood her cheeks, but not from embarrassment, from fury. She snatched the paper from his hands with more force than was strictly polite. "They are private correspondence, sir, and none of your concern." "Private correspondence that includes a rather ingenious scheme for reducing tariff costs through sequential shipping," Jonathan said, his voice carrying genuine admiration rather than mockery. He looked up at her then, really looked, and Florence saw something in his grey eyes she had never encountered before. Interest, not in her fortune or her father's connections, but in her mind. "The calculation here about warehousing costs in Liverpool versus Hull is absolutely brilliant. Whoever devised this understands trade economics better than most merchants I have dealt with." Around them, the crowd had begun to notice the commotion. Florence heard Lady Rutherford's nasal voice cutting through the music. "How awkward. Miss Bancroft seems to have dropped her shopping lists all over the floor." The titter of laughter that followed was familiar, expected, and still sharp enough to draw blood. Florence gathered her papers with swift, precise movements, shoving them back into her reticule without meeting Jonathan's gaze. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Blackwood. I believe we have provided sufficient entertainment for the evening." "It is not entertainment," Jonathan said quietly, rising to his feet beside her. He was tall, she realized, with shoulders broadened by work rather than merely good tailoring. His evening clothes were well made but not new, and there was something in the way he held himself that suggested a man more comfortable in a field than a ballroom. "It is genius. May I ask who created these projections?" Florence lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "I did, Mr. Blackwood. And before you express shock or disbelief, allow me to assure you that my comprehension of mathematics persists, despite the unfortunate handicap of having been born female." The corner of his mouth twitched upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I was not going to express shock, Miss Bancroft. I was going to ask if you would be willing to look at some rather desperate financial problems I am currently facing. My estate in Surrey is in dire need of exactly the sort of innovative thinking you have demonstrated here." Before Florence could respond to this extraordinary statement, Lady Rutherford appeared at Jonathan's elbow, her expression radiating predatory determination. "Mr. Blackwood, how kind of you to assist poor Miss Bancroft, though I must say, carrying business papers to a Christmas ball is most peculiar. My daughter Catherine was just mentioning how much she enjoyed your conversation earlier. She is standing just over there. Do come say hello." Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he bowed with perfect politeness. "You are too kind, Lady Rutherford. However, I was just in the middle of a rather important discussion with Miss Bancroft about Scottish wool trade." "Wool trade?" Lady Rutherford's laugh was high and artificial. "How absolutely fascinating. Though surely such topics are better left to men of business. Catherine plays the pianoforte most beautifully, you know. Perhaps after the next dance?" Florence watched the familiar dance of social maneuvering with the detached interest of someone who had long since stopped hoping to be included. She knew exactly how this scene would end. Jonathan Blackwood would make his excuses, retreat to safer social ground with the pretty, uncomplicated Miss Rutherford, and Florence would return to her position by the refreshment table. Another evening survived, if not enjoyed. But Jonathan did something unexpected. He turned his back quite deliberately on Lady Rutherford and extended his hand toward Florence. "Miss Bancroft, would you grant me the honor of the next dance? I find myself eager to discuss profit margins and shipping schedules in more detail. A waltz should provide sufficient time for at least a preliminary consultation." The ballroom seemed to fall silent, though Florence knew that was impossible. The orchestra was still playing, couples still moved across the floor, yet all she could hear was the thundering of her own heart as she stared at his outstretched hand. Lady Rutherford made a small sound of displeasure. "The waltz has not been approved for Miss Bancroft by the patronesses. She cannot possibly dance it in good society." "Then it is fortunate," Jonathan said, his grey eyes never leaving Florence's face, "that I care more for good conversation than the arbitrary dictates of the patronesses. What say you, Miss Bancroft? Will you risk scandalizing society by discussing economics with me while we dance?" Florence placed her hand in his, feeling the roughness of those unexpected calluses through her glove. "I believe, Mr. Blackwood, that society was already quite scandalized by my existence long before you offered to dance with me. We might as well give them something truly shocking to discuss." As he led her onto the floor and placed his hand at her waist with careful propriety, Florence realized that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully ordered world. For the first time in 3 seasons of social torture, someone was looking at her not as a problem to be solved or an unfortunate package to be unloaded, but as a person whose mind held value. "Now then," Jonathan said as they began to move through the steps of the waltz, "tell me about this scheme for reducing warehouse costs in Liverpool. My estate grows excellent wool, but the transportation expenses are destroying any potential profit." And Florence, who had spent years hiding her mathematical brilliance behind fans and false smiles, found herself explaining complex financial strategies to a man who listened with genuine attention. Around them, society whispered and stared, but for once she did not care. It was then that Florence Jane Bancroft's life truly began. The weeks following the Christmas ball brought changes to Florence's routine that she had not anticipated. 3 days after their encounter, a footman arrived at the Bancroft townhouse on Bedford Square with a formal request from Jonathan Charles Blackwood. He wished to consult with her father regarding certain financial matters pertaining to the Blackwood estates in Surrey, and if Miss Bancroft would not find it too burdensome, he would be grateful for her expertise as well. Oliver Bancroft, a practical man who had built his textile empire through shrewd calculation rather than inherited privilege, took one look at his daughter's carefully neutral expression, and agreed immediately. If the younger son of a viscount needed business advice, Oliver saw no reason not to provide it, particularly if it gave his brilliant daughter a legitimate excuse to use the mind society seemed determined to waste. The first consultation took place in the offices of Bancroft Textiles in the City of London, a commodious building near the docks, where the scent of wool and dye mixed with the salt tang of the Thames. Florence presented herself in her most severe day dress, her hair pulled back in a practical chignon, carrying a leather portfolio that held her most recent calculations on fabric pricing and transportation costs. Jonathan was already there when she entered her father's private office, standing by the window that overlooked the warehouse floor below. He had exchanged his evening clothes for more practical attire, and Florence noted that he seemed more comfortable here, away from the rigid formality of Mayfair ballrooms. "Miss Bancroft," he said, turning as she entered, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I realize this is highly irregular." "Everything about our acquaintance has been irregular, Mr. Blackwood," Florence replied, setting her portfolio on the large oak desk. "I see no reason to depart from this path now. My father mentioned you have concerns about the profitability of your wool production." What followed was 3 hours of the most stimulating conversation Florence had experienced in her entire life. Jonathan laid out his situation with brutal honesty. His elder brother would inherit the viscountcy and the primary estates, leaving Jonathan with a smaller property in Surrey that had been mismanaged for years. The land itself was good, the sheep healthy, and the wool of excellent quality, but the costs of bringing the product to market were consuming any potential profit. Florence spread her papers across the desk, explaining the intricacies of shipping schedules and warehouse arrangements with the ease of someone who had been studying such matters for years. She showed him how consolidating shipments with other small producers could reduce individual costs, how timing sales to coincide with seasonal demand could increase prices, and how certain legal arrangements could minimize tax burdens without crossing into illegal territory. "This is extraordinary," Jonathan said, studying one of her detailed spreadsheets. His finger traced down a column of figures, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You have identified efficiencies I never even considered. How did you learn all of this?" Florence felt warmth bloom in her chest, acknowledging the genuine respect in his voice. "My father began teaching me about his business when I was 12 years of age. He had no sons, you see, and he believed that intelligence was not limited by sex, regardless of what society might claim. I have been managing his ledgers and calculating his tariffs for years, though we keep that information strictly confidential." "Why?" Jonathan looked up from the papers, his grey eyes serious. "You clearly have a gift for this work. Why hide it?" "Because, Mr. Blackwood, a woman who can calculate compound interest is considered far less marriageable than one who can only embroider cushions and play the pianoforte poorly," Florence said with a trace of bitterness she usually kept well hidden. "My father is wealthy enough that I need not worry about dying destitute, but even his fortune cannot overcome the basic facts of my situation. I am too large, too intelligent, and too interested in unfeminine pursuits to ever be considered a desirable match. I learned years ago to keep the mathematics private and the embroidery visible, even though I am terrible at one and excellent at the other." Jonathan set down the papers and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Then society is filled with fools, Miss Bancroft. I would take a woman who can save my estate over one who can play Mozart any day of the week." The words settled between them like an unexpected weight upon the ledgers, weighted with meanings Florence was not certain she should examine too closely. She cleared her throat and returned her attention to the calculations spread before them. "We should discuss the implementation timeline," she said, pleased that her voice remained steady. "If you can arrange partnerships with 3 other small producers within your district, we could have the first consolidated shipment ready by early February." Over the following weeks, what had begun as a single consultation swiftly transformed into a series of regular meetings. Jonathan would arrive at the Bancroft offices every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, ostensibly to discuss business matters with Oliver Bancroft, but everyone involved understood that the real work was happening between Jonathan and Florence. They never danced again after that first waltz. never appeared together at balls or assemblies, never rode in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, never engaged in any of the traditional courtship rituals that society recognized and approved. Instead, they met in offices smelling of wool and ink, bent over ledgers and shipping manifests, building a partnership based on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility rather than social conventions. Florence found herself looking forward to those Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. She dressed with particular care on those days, choosing colors that flattered her complexion and styles that made her feel confident rather than apologetic about her figure. She told herself it was simply professional pride, the same attention she would give to any important business meeting. But when Jonathan smiled at one of her more clever solutions, or when his hand accidentally brushed hers, as they both reached for the same document, Florence felt something far removed from professional satisfaction. She felt alive in a way she had never experienced before, valued for precisely those qualities that society had taught her to hide. The calculations she created for his estate were perhaps the best work she had ever done. She spent evenings in her father's study running projections, testing different scenarios, finding ways to maximize profit while minimizing risk. When she presented the final comprehensive plan to Jonathan in mid-December, she watched his face as he studied the numbers, seeing the moment when he truly understood what she had created. "This could work," he said slowly, his voice thick with an emotion she could not quite identify. "This could actually save my estate, provide proper income for my tenants, give me the means to marry without being a fortune hunter." He looked up at her then, and Florence saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Bancroft, Florence, I do not have adequate words to thank you for this." The use of her Christian name should have been shocking, improper, but Florence found she did not care. "You need not thank me, Jonathan. This is what I do. What I am good at doing. It has been a pleasure to work on something that matters." "It matters more than you know," he said softly. "You have given me hope, Florence, not just for my land, but for my future, for possibilities I had not dared to consider." Florence understood in that moment that they were no longer merely discussing estate management and profit projections. They were standing at the edge of something far more perilous and far more valuable, something that could transform both their lives if they were brave enough to reach for it. But before either of them could find the words to cross that threshold, Oliver Bancroft entered the office with news of an urgent matter requiring Florence's attention. The moment passed, carried away on the tide of ordinary business concerns, but the feeling remained, humming beneath every subsequent interaction like a promise waiting to be spoken aloud. January 6th, 12th night, arrived with the bitter cold that had settled over London like a suffocating blanket. The Thames had begun to freeze at its edges, and servants spoke in worried whispers about the possibility of a full freeze, something that had not happened in over a decade. Despite the cold, or perhaps because of it, society threw itself into the traditional 12th night celebrations with desperate gaiety. Lord Stratton's ball was the most anticipated event of the season, a massive affair that would mark the official end of the Christmas festivities. Florence had debated whether to attend at all, but her father had received a specific invitation that included her by name, and Oliver Bancroft believed in facing society rather than hiding from it. Florence dressed with particular care that evening, choosing a gown of deep sapphire silk that her modista had designed specifically to flatter her fuller figure. The neckline was modest but elegant. The waist emphasized her natural shape rather than trying to minimize it, and the sapphire brought out a deep intensity in her eyes. She wore her mother's sapphires at her throat, a statement of quiet confidence rather than apology. When she entered Lord Stratton's ballroom, she saw Jonathan almost immediately. He stood near the terrace doors in conversation with several other gentlemen, and something about the tense set of his shoulders suggested the discussion was not entirely pleasant. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and he offered her a small smile that made her heart lift despite her nervousness. Florence made her way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with the few guests who acknowledged her. She had learned long ago to navigate these events with a sort of pleasant invisibility, neither drawing attention nor completely disappearing. She found a position near a cluster of potted palms where she could observe without being in the direct line of scrutiny. It was from this vantage point that she heard Lady Stratton's voice rising above the general conversation, addressing someone Florence could not quite see. "Oh, how delightful that Miss Bancroft has chosen to grace us with her presence this evening. One does wonder how the chairs will manage, but I suppose we must make accommodations for those with such an abundance of feminine charms." The words landed like physical blows, stealing Florence's breath with their casual cruelty. She had heard similar comments before, had learned to deflect them with practiced indifference, but something about hearing them spoken so publicly, in a room where Jonathan was present, made them cut deeper than usual. She looked toward where Jonathan stood with his companions and saw that he had heard the comment as well. His entire body had gone rigid, his face draining of color. For 5 endless seconds, he stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was terrified, not of his own social censure, but of the far greater damage society would inflict upon Florence should he dare to defend her openly. Florence watched him, willing him to move, to speak, to do something that would indicate he understood the cruelty of what had just been said. But before Jonathan could find his voice, before he could take even a single step in Florence's direction, Lady Stratton's daughter materialized at his elbow. Catherine Stratton was everything Florence was not. Delicate, blonde, with the sort of fragile beauty that made men want to protect rather than respect her. She placed a gloved hand on Jonathan's arm with practiced familiarity, tilting her head up to smile at him. "Mr. Blackwood, you promised me the first waltz, remember? The musicians are just beginning." Florence saw Jonathan's jaw work, saw him glance in her direction with something that looked like desperation, but Catherine was already drawing him toward the dance floor with the inexorable force of social expectation. To refuse would have created a scene far worse than anything Lady Stratton had already accomplished. Jonathan allowed himself to be led away, casting one last helpless look over his shoulder as Florence stood alone among the potted palms. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and careful avoidance. Florence stayed for precisely 1 hour, the minimum required by politeness, then pleaded a headache and called for her father's carriage. She saw Jonathan approaching as she made her way toward the entrance, but she deliberately turned away, unable to bear whatever excuse or apology he might offer. She spent the night in her father's study, surrounded by ledgers and calculations, seeking sanctuary in numbers that adhered to predictable rules. But even mathematics could not erase the memory of those 5 seconds of frozen silence, the moment when Jonathan had had the opportunity to defend her and had instead stood paralyzed by social fear. The morning brought a letter, delivered by Jonathan's own hand to the Bancroft townhouse. Florence stared at the sealed envelope for a long moment before breaking it open with hands that trembled slightly. The letter was both eloquent and anguished, a detailed apology that explained his fear, his shame, his recognition of his own cowardice. He wrote that he had been terrified not of society's judgment, but of revealing how much he cared for her, how deeply she had come to matter to him in the weeks of their collaboration. He begged for her understanding, for another chance to prove himself worthy of her respect. Florence read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a single line in her precise, elegant script. Returned unopened, no further correspondence desired. She instructed the footman to return the letter exactly as she had prepared it, knowing that the message would be clear. Words were cheap, easily written in the safety of one's study. Actions were what mattered, and Jonathan's actions, or lack thereof, had spoken with devastating clarity. For 2 weeks, Florence refused to see Jonathan, refused to read his letters, refused even to discuss him with her father. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, calculating tariffs and profit margins until her eyes burned from the strain. She told herself that she had been foolish to believe that a few weeks of intellectual companionship could overcome the fundamental truths of her situation. She was not made for love or romance or any of the soft emotions that seem to come so easily to other women. She was made for numbers and logic and the cold comfort of profitable business ventures. But late at night, alone in her room, she would sometimes take out Jonathan's letters and reread them, searching for something she could not quite name, a proof that she had mattered to him as more than just a convenient source of financial advice. She sought evidence that 5 seconds of paralyzed silence did not negate weeks of genuine connection, an assurance that she was not completely unworthy of the sort of love she saw other women take for granted. She found none of these things in his words, beautifully written though they were. And so she continued to return each letter unopened, building a wall of cold silence between herself and the man who had briefly made her believe she might be more than society's unwanted spinster. January brought weather so severe that even hardened Londoners spoke of it with awe. The temperature dropped to levels not seen in decades, and the Thames began to freeze solid from bank to bank. By the third week of the month, the ice was thick enough to support human weight, and enterprising merchants began setting up temporary shops and amusements on the frozen river. A frost fair was declared, the first in over 20 years, and society flocked to the novelty with the same enthusiasm they brought to any new entertainment. Florence heard about the frost fair from her father, who viewed it primarily as a business opportunity. Textile merchants were already setting up stalls to sell warm clothing and blankets, and Oliver Bancroft was considering whether to establish a temporary shop himself. Florence listened to his plans with half her attention, more concerned with the urgent financial matter that had arrived that morning in a letter from Surrey. 13 tenant families on the Blackwood estate were facing starvation. The winter had been too severe, the roads too impassable for normal commerce, and the grain stores too depleted to last until spring. The estate steward had written to Oliver Bancroft in desperation, knowing of the business relationship between the Bancroft and Blackwood families, begging for advice or assistance. Florence read the letter 3 times, her mind automatically calculating supplies and transportation costs, even as her heart ached at the thought of Jonathan's tenants suffering. The financial plan she had created for him was brilliant. She knew that without false modesty, but it had been designed for normal weather conditions. It had not accounted for a winter so brutal that roads became impassable and normal commerce ground to a halt. She was still staring at the letter when her father's butler entered the study with an apologetic expression. "Miss Bancroft, there is a gentleman at the servants' entrance requesting to speak with you. He says it is urgent." Florence glanced at the clock. It was 2 hours past midnight, an entirely inappropriate time for any caller, let alone one arriving at the servants' entrance. "Did he give his name?" "Mr. Jonathan Blackwood, miss. He appears quite distressed and refuses to leave until he has spoken with you." Florence's first instinct was to send him away, to maintain the wall of silence she had built so carefully over the past 2 weeks. But the letter from the estate steward sat on the desk before her, a reminder that this was not merely about wounded pride or romantic disappointment. There were 13 families facing genuine hardship, and whatever her feelings about Jonathan's personal failures, she would not allow innocent people to suffer for them. "Show him to the study," she said quietly, "and bring tea. This appears to be a business matter that will require some time to resolve." Jonathan arrived looking as though he had ridden through a severe ordeal to reach her. His hair was disheveled, his coat mud-splattered, and his face bore the marks of exhaustion and desperation. He stopped just inside the door, staring at her with eyes that held more emotion than Florence was prepared to handle. "I received your letter," he said without preamble. "The one from my steward. I know you must have seen it as well, since he copied Oliver in his plea for help." He took a step closer, his voice rough with fatigue. "Not for myself, but for my tenants. 13 families who will not survive this winter without intervention. Whatever you think of me, whatever anger you rightfully hold, please do not punish them for my failures." Florence gestured to the chair across from her desk, her expression carefully neutral. "Sit down, Jonathan. You look ready to collapse. This is a business consultation, nothing more. Your personal matters do not concern me." She saw him flinch at the coldness in her voice, but he sat obediently, watching as she spread the steward's letter and several sheets of calculations across the desk between them. For several minutes, neither spoke, as Florence worked through the numbers, her pen scratching across paper as she tested different scenarios. "The problem," she said finally, "is that all traditional supply routes are blocked by snow and ice. Normal transportation is impossible given current conditions." She looked up at him then, seeing the desperation in his face. "However, there may be an alternative solution. If we could establish a temporary growing operation using root vegetables that mature quickly in cold conditions, your tenants could produce their own food supply rather than waiting for external delivery." Jonathan leaned forward, studying her calculations with the intensity she remembered from their earlier collaborations. Turnips? You are suggesting we grow turnips in the middle of January? Not ordinary turnips, Florence corrected, warming to the problem despite her intention to remain cold and professional. There are varieties developed in Scotland specifically for winter growth. They can be planted in protected conditions and mature in 6 to 8 weeks. If we can source seeds and establish proper growing conditions in barns or other sheltered structures, your tenants could have food by mid-March. That is brilliant, Jonathan said, his voice filled with the same admiration she remembered from their first meeting. Absolutely brilliant. But the cost of seeds, the materials for proper growing conditions, the labor involved in setting everything up, I do not have capital available for such an undertaking. Everything is tied up in the spring wool production. Florence had already calculated those costs, had already considered the various financing options. She made several more notes, then pushed a sheet of paper across the desk toward him. My father's company will front the costs as an interest-bearing loan. The terms are fair, the repayment schedule aligned with your wool profits. It is good business, Jonathan, nothing more. He studied the numbers for a long moment, then looked up at her with eyes that held too much hope. Florence, I need to explain about that night at the Stratton ball. I need you to understand what happened. There is nothing to understand, Florence said, keeping her voice level with effort. You froze when confronted with the social cost of defending me. It was a perfectly natural response. I do not hold it against you. That is not true, and you know it, Jonathan said with sudden heat. You hold it very much against me, and you have every right to do so. I was a coward, Florence. I stood there for 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, paralyzed by social fear, a damning cowardice, and let that vicious woman insult you without saying a single word in your defense. And then you danced with her daughter, Florence added quietly. Do not forget that part. Jonathan's jaw tightened. I did not want to dance with Catherine Stratton. I wanted to cross the ballroom, stand beside you, and announce to everyone present that you are worth more than all of them combined. But I was terrified. Terrified of what? Florence demanded, her careful control beginning to crack. Of social censure? Of losing your standing among people who care more about appearance than substance? Of being associated with the fat spinster that everyone mocks? No, Jonathan said with sudden fierce intensity. I was terrified of them seeing how much I loved you, how completely you had captured not just my mind, but my heart, how I thought about you every waking moment, how your brilliance and kindness and strength had become the essential current by which my own life is navigated. I was terrified because I knew that once society saw the truth of my feelings, they would use them to hurt you even more than they already had. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and more than Florence had been prepared to hear. She stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the dark garden, needing distance to process what he had just admitted. That is a convenient excuse, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Fear of revealing feelings is just another form of cowardice. You are absolutely right, Jonathan said, and she heard him move to stand behind her, close but not touching. It was cowardice, Florence, the worst kind, because it hurt the person I care for most in this world. And I hate myself for those 5 seconds of paralyzed silence more than I can express. But I'm here now, at 2 hours past midnight, covered in mud from riding through the worst winter in decades, begging you not for forgiveness, but for a chance to prove that I can be braver than my fear. Florence turned to face him, seeing the exhaustion and sincerity written in every line of his face. What are you asking for, Jonathan? A chance to fix this, he said simply. Not just the situation with my tenants, though God knows I am grateful for your help with that, but a chance to prove that I can stand beside you publicly, proudly, and damn whatever society thinks about it. A chance to show you that my actions can match the words I have written in all those letters you refused to read. Florence felt something in her chest beginning to crack. The careful wall of ice she had built around her heart finally gave way, showing its first profound fractures. And what if I cannot trust you? What if I cannot believe that you will be brave when it matters? Jonathan met her gaze steadily. Then test me, Florence. Set whatever conditions you require. I will meet them or die trying. Because a life without you in it is not a life I want to live." Before Florence could respond, her father entered the study carrying a tray with tea and refreshments. Oliver Bancroft took one look at the scene before him, his brilliant daughter facing a mud-splattered gentleman in the middle of the night, surrounded by papers covered in calculations, and simply smiled. "I thought you two might need sustenance," he said mildly. "Business consultations at this hour tend to be quite draining. I will leave you to your work." As the door closed behind him, Florence felt a laugh escape despite herself. Her father had always understood her better than anyone, had always given her the space to make her own decisions. She looked at Jonathan, seeing him properly for the first time since he had arrived, and felt the last of her anger beginning to dissolve into something softer and more terrifying. "Very well," she said quietly. "We will work on this problem together. But when we are finished, when your tenants are safe and fed, we will address the other matter between us." "And what matter is that?" Jonathan asked, though his eyes suggested he knew perfectly well. Florence met his gaze with the same directness she brought to her business calculations. "Whether you have the courage to claim me publicly, Jonathan, in front of everyone who has ever mocked me or dismissed me, because I will not settle for a man who loves me only in private, who values my mind in his office, but is ashamed of my body in his ballroom. I deserve better than that." "You deserve everything," Jonathan said softly, "and I intend to prove to you that I can provide it." They worked through the rest of the night, side by side at her father's desk, creating a comprehensive plan to save the 13 tenant families. Florence calculated seed quantities and growing requirements, while Jonathan sketched barn modifications and labor schedules. They argued over details, refined projections, tested alternative scenarios, falling back into the comfortable partnership they had built over weeks of collaboration. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside the study windows, they had a complete plan. It was ambitious, risky, and would require Jonathan to spend every penny of available capital. But it would work. Florence knew it would work, because her calculations never lied, because logic and mathematics were the one area where she could always find solid ground. Jonathan stood to leave as the household began to wake, gathering his mud-stained coat and the precious papers that might save his people. At the door he turned back to look at her, his grey eyes serious. "You told me I would be your coward, Florence, but only if I was brave enough to claim you publicly in front of everyone who ever laughed at either of us. I heard you, and I am going to be brave enough. I promise you that." Florence watched him leave, then returned to her desk, where his final words echoed in her mind. She had set an impossible standard, she knew that. Society would not forgive a public declaration, would not accept a union between a younger son with ruined lands and a wealthy merchant's daughter who defied every feminine ideal. They would be ostracized, mocked, potentially destroyed. But as she looked at the calculations spread before her, proof of what they could accomplish together, Florence felt something she had not experienced in years. Hope, fragile and terrifying, but undeniably present. The question now was whether Jonathan's courage would match his words, or whether she would find herself disappointed once again. 3 days passed before Florence heard from Jonathan again. 3 days during which she tried not to count the hours, tried not to jump every time a servant entered a room, tried not to scan every letter that arrived hoping for his handwriting. She told herself it was merely curiosity about the implementation of their plan for the tenants, professional interest in seeing her calculations put into practice. On the morning of the 4th day, her father entered the breakfast room with an expression Florence had learned to recognize. Oliver Bancroft looked pleased with himself, which usually meant he had done something his daughter would either love or hate, with no middle ground between the extremes. "The Frost Fair has become quite the spectacle," he said casually, buttering his toast with elaborate care. "They have set up a printing press on the ice, can you imagine? Selling commemorative certificates to prove one has walked on the frozen Thames. Quite clever from a business perspective." Florence sipped her chocolate, waiting for the real point of this conversation to emerge. Her father never discussed random business observations over breakfast without purpose. "I am thinking of setting up a temporary stall myself," Oliver continued. "Selling warm textiles, wool blankets, that sort of thing. The profit margin could be quite substantial, given the demand and limited supply." I wondered if you might accompany me this afternoon to survey potential locations. You do not need my help selecting a store location, Father, Florence said with mild exasperation. You have been in the textile business for 30 years. What are you actually planning? Oliver Bancroft smiled, the expression warm with fatherly affection and something that looked like pride. I am planning to support my brilliant daughter in whatever she decides to do next. There are rumors circulating about a certain event scheduled for this afternoon at the Frost Fair. Something involving a public declaration of some kind. I thought you might want to be present. Florence set down her cup with more force than strictly necessary. If Jonathan Blackwood thinks he can simply make some grand gesture and erase everything that happened, he is sorely mistaken. I do not believe he thinks any such thing, her father said mildly. I believe he is trying to do exactly what you asked him to do. Be brave enough to claim you publicly in front of everyone who has ever mocked or dismissed either of you. The question is whether you are brave enough to let him try. The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Florence realized with a start that she was afraid. Not of Jonathan failing to be brave, but of him succeeding. Of what it would mean if he actually stood before society and declared his regard for her. Of the vulnerability required to accept such a public declaration, to expose her own feelings where everyone could see and judge them. What if he disappoints me again? She asked quietly. Then he will have proven himself unworthy, Oliver said simply. But Florence, my darling girl, what if he does not? What if he proves to be exactly as brave as you challenged him to be? Will you have the courage to meet him halfway? Florence thought about those words as she dressed that afternoon in practical, warm clothing, as she climbed into her father's carriage for the journey to the frozen Thames, as she stepped carefully onto the ice that covered one of England's greatest rivers. The Frost Fair had transformed the frozen waterway into a temporary city, with tents and stalls and amusements stretching as far as the eye could see. Crowds thronged the ice despite the bitter cold, drawn by the novelty and the knowledge that such opportunities came perhaps once in a generation. Oliver guided her through the crowds with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in any environment, merchant or aristocrat. They passed printing presses and roasting chestnut vendors, puppet shows and fortune tellers, merchants selling everything from hot wine to commemorative medals. And there, in a cleared space near the center of the fair, Florence saw a raised platform surrounded by what appeared to be half of fashionable society. Jonathan stood on that platform, and even from a distance Florence could see the tension in his shoulders, the set of his jaw that suggested he was preparing himself for battle. As she and her father drew closer, she recognized many of the faces in the crowd. Lady Rutherford and her daughter, Catherine, Lord Stratton and his wife, every society matron who had ever looked down their nose at Florence or whispered cruel assessments of her figure. And there, standing at the very front with an expression of smug anticipation, was Lady Stratton herself, the woman whose words 2 weeks ago had sparked this entire crisis. Florence felt her father's hand tighten on her arm. "Do you want to leave? We can turn around right now if you wish." But Florence found herself moving forward instead, drawn by something she could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or hope, or simply the need to see how this extraordinary scene would conclude. Jonathan saw her then, his eyes finding hers across the crowd with unerring accuracy. She saw relief flash across his face, followed by determination so fierce it took her breath away. He raised his hand, calling for silence, and the crowd quieted with the eager anticipation of people sensing impending scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan began, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen river, "I have called you here today to address a matter that has been troubling me for some weeks now. Specifically, I wish to respond to comments made by Lady Stratton at her 12th night ball 2 weeks past." A collective gasp went through the crowd. One did not publicly reference social slights, did not drag private cruelties into public forums. Lady Stratton's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "You are out of line, sir," Lord Stratton called out. "Whatever grievance you imagine you have can be addressed through proper channels, not theatrical displays on a frozen river." "I disagree," Jonathan said with perfect calm. "Some matters require public address because they were committed publicly." Lady Stratton made certain remarks about Miss Florence Jane Bancroft's appearance, suggesting that her figure required special accommodation and using language clearly designed to humiliate and wound. Florence felt the crowd's attention shift to her, felt the familiar burn of shame heating her cheeks. But then Jonathan's voice cut through her embarrassment with words she had not expected. I stood silent that evening when those words were spoken. For 5 seconds that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was paralyzed by social fear. I allowed a brilliant, generous, extraordinary woman to be insulted in my presence without saying a single word in her defense. That silence was the greatest failure of my life, and I am here today to rectify it publicly as the original offense was committed. He turned then to look directly at Lady Stratton, and Florence saw steel in his expression she had not witnessed before. You mocked Miss Bancroft's appearance, madam. You suggested her figure made her somehow less worthy of respect or dignity. Allow me to correct your error. Jonathan pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket, holding them up for the crowd to see. These documents represent a comprehensive financial plan created by Miss Florence Bancroft for the management of my estate in Surrey. Her calculations, her brilliant, innovative strategies have not only saved my lands from ruin, but also saved 13 tenant families from starvation this winter. He looked around the crowd, making eye contact with several shocked faces. While you were all discussing fashion and gossip at your balls, Miss Bancroft was designing cold-weather growing operations that will keep 13 families alive through a winter of unprecedented severity. While you were judging her figure, she was calculating seed quantities and barn modifications with mathematical precision that would shame most trained accountants. While you were mocking her appearance, she was proving herself to be more intelligent, more competent, and more genuinely valuable than anyone in this entire assembly. Florence felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Around her she heard the murmurs of the crowd, some shocked, some admiring, some still disapproving. But Jonathan was not finished. You mocked her figure, Lady Stratton, while wearing Bancroft fabrics that you purchased from her father's shops. You sneered at her intelligence while benefiting from the textile innovations her family company provides to all of England. Your cruelty was not just offensive, it was hypocritical of the highest order. He turned then to face Lord Stratton directly. And you, sir, have built your fortune partially on wool provided by estates like mine. You sneer at the merchant class while depending on their products for your comfort and status. You judge women like Miss Bancroft while your own character is so twisted that no amount of tailoring can hide its deformity. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whistle of wind across the frozen river. Then Jonathan did something that made Florence's heart stop entirely. He stepped down from the platform and walked directly to where she stood with her father. He dropped to one knee on the ice, heedless of the cold or the impropriety or the hundreds of eyes watching every movement. He looked up at Florence with eyes that held nothing but honesty and love and terrifying vulnerability. "Miss Florence Jane Bancroft," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembled crowd. "I am a man of modest means whose coat may forever carry the scent of hay and honest labor rather than French cologne. I have dirt under my fingernails from working my own fields, and I know more about sheep than I do about society. I cannot offer you a great title or vast wealth or social prominence." He reached up to take her gloved hand in his, and Florence let him, too stunned to do anything else. "But I can offer you a partnership built on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility. I can offer you a man who loves your brilliant mind, your generous heart, and yes, the abundant charms of your person. I can offer you honesty and courage, and the promise that I will spend every day of my life proving myself worthy of your regard." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a ring of modest beauty, a single sapphire set in gold. "I am asking you to marry me, Florence, to be my wife, my partner, my best friend, and greatest ally. I am asking you to build a life with me, where your intelligence is celebrated rather than hidden, where your talents are used to their fullest potential, where you are valued for precisely those qualities that make you extraordinary." Florence looked down at him, at this man who had started as a business acquaintance and become something infinitely more precious. She thought about the weeks of collaboration, the way he had looked at her calculations with genuine admiration, the way he had listened to her ideas with respect rather than condescension. She thought about his failure at the Stratton ball and his courage now kneeling on ice in front of everyone who had ever mocked either of them. "You neglected to mention that your mathematics are quite lamentable without my intervention," she said, and felt a laugh bubble up in her chest at his startled expression. "The wool production calculations you showed me when we first met were demonstrably inaccurate. You had confused pounds sterling with pounds weight in at least 3 places." Jonathan's face split into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "Then it is fortunate I am asking a mathematical genius to marry me. Someone needs to keep me from bankrupting myself through basic arithmetic errors." "Indeed," Florence agreed, feeling her own smile beginning to match his. She was aware of the crowd watching, aware that this moment would be discussed in every drawing room in London for months to come, aware that accepting him would mean defying every social expectation placed upon her, and she found she did not care even slightly. "I have conditions," she said, keeping her voice serious even as joy flooded through her chest. "First, I will continue to work on business calculations and estate management. I will not give up my mathematical work simply because I am married." "I would not dare suggest such a thing," Jonathan said solemnly. "Your mind is one of the things I love most about you. Second, if anyone ever insults me in your presence again, you will defend me immediately and publicly. No more frozen silences. I promise you," Jonathan said with fierce intensity, "that I will spend the rest of my life being brave enough to match you. No more cowardice, Florence. You deserve better, and I will be better." "And third," Florence said, her voice softening, "you must promise never to be ashamed of me, not of my figure, not of my mind, not of my unconventional interests. If I am to be your wife, I will be your wife in all settings, not just in private." Jonathan stood then, still holding her hand, and turned to face the assembled crowd. "Let me be absolutely clear to everyone present. I am not ashamed of Florence Bancroft. I am proud of her brilliance, proud of her kindness, proud of her strength, and yes, proud of her beauty. Anyone who cannot see what I see when I look at her is simply blind." He turned back to Florence, and she saw in his eyes the same terrifying vulnerability she felt. "Now then, Miss Bancroft, having heard my promises and set your conditions, will you answer my question? Will you marry me?" Florence looked at the man before her, this younger son of a viscount, who smelled of honest work rather than expensive cologne, whose hands bore calluses from physical labor, whose estate had been saved by her calculations. She thought about the life he was offering her, a partnership where her intelligence would be valued rather than hidden, where her body would be appreciated rather than mocked, where she could be fully herself without apology. "Yes," she said clearly, loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Yes, Jonathan Charles Blackwood, I will marry you. I will be your wife and your partner and your mathematical consultant whenever you confuse different types of pounds." The crowd erupted in sound, some applauding, some gasping, some muttering disapproval. But Florence barely heard them. She was too focused on the way Jonathan pulled her into his arms, the way he kissed her right there on the frozen Thames in front of God and society, and everyone who had ever doubted either of them. It was improper and scandalous and absolutely perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and grinning like fools, Florence saw her father standing nearby with tears in his eyes and pride written across his face. She saw Lady Stratton's shocked expression, Lord Rutherford's disapproval, Catherine Stratton's envy. But she also saw other faces in the crowd, younger women looking at her with something that might have been hope, merchants and tradesmen nodding approval, even a few society matrons whose smiles suggested they were not entirely opposed to this dramatic rebellion against convention. "We are going to be thoroughly discussed for months," Jonathan murmured against her ear. "Good," Florence replied. "Let them discuss. We will be too busy being happy to care." They were married 6 weeks later, in a ceremony that combined Oliver Bancroft's merchant connections with the Blackwood family's aristocratic traditions. The wedding was neither as grand as a duke's daughter might have expected, nor as modest as a younger son's finances might have dictated. It was, instead, a perfect reflection of the couple themselves, practical, genuine, and focused on what mattered rather than what impressed. The 5 years that followed brought exactly the partnership Jonathan had promised. Florence divided her time between their Surrey estate and her father's offices in London, continuing to provide business consultations that enhanced both the Blackwood and Bancroft family fortunes. She became known, discreetly at first, and then more openly, as one of the most brilliant financial minds in England. Merchants and landowners began to seek her advice, and she built a reputation based entirely on the quality of her calculations rather than any social connections. Jonathan proved himself to be a man of his word. He defended Florence publicly. Whenever anyone questioned her unconventional activities, he praised her intelligence to anyone who would listen, and he never once suggested that marriage should mean the end of her mathematical work. Instead, he encouraged her, supported her, and frequently reminded people that his estate's prosperity was due entirely to his wife's brilliance. They had 3 children in those 5 years, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom learned from infancy that their mother was as comfortable with ledgers as with lullabies. Florence hired a nursemaid to handle the more traditional maternal duties, preferring to spend her limited time with her children teaching them mathematics and logical thinking rather than embroidery and watercolors. Society never fully accepted their unconventional arrangement, but Florence found she cared less and less as the years passed. She had something far more valuable than social approval. She had a partnership built on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and genuine love. She had work that challenged and fulfilled her. She had children who would grow up knowing that intelligence and capability were not limited by gender. And she had Jonathan. One afternoon in late January, exactly 5 years after their dramatic proposal on the frozen Thames, Florence sat in the estate office working through crop rotation calculations while Jonathan reviewed tenant contracts. Their hands found each other across the desk with the casual intimacy of long familiarity, fingers interlacing without either of them looking up from their work. "I was thinking," Jonathan said absently, making a note on one of his documents, "that we might try that new Scottish hay variety you mentioned last week. The projected yield increase could offset the higher seed cost within 2 seasons." "Only if we can secure favorable shipping rates," Florence replied, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper to run the numbers. "I will need to check current tariff schedules and warehouse availability in Edinburgh. Give me an hour to create projections." "Take 2 hours," Jonathan said with a smile. "I know better than to rush your calculations. They are always worth the wait." Florence looked up at him then, this man who had seen her value when no one else bothered to look beyond her unconventional appearance. This man who had been brave enough to claim her publicly, despite every social obstacle. This man who still looked at her with the same admiration he had shown when her notebook had scattered across that ballroom floor so many years ago. "Have I mentioned today that I love you?" she asked. "Not yet," Jonathan replied, his grey eyes warm with affection, "but I am always happy to hear it." "I love you," Florence said simply, "even when you confuse pounds sterling with pounds weight." Jonathan laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "And I love you, especially because you always catch my mathematical errors before I can bankrupt us." They returned to their work then, hands still clasped across the desk, building their unusual but perfectly matched life one calculation at a time. Outside, winter wind howled across the Surrey countryside, but inside the estate office, surrounded by ledgers and contracts and projections for a prosperous future, Florence Jane Bancroft Blackwood felt nothing but warmth. She had found something society insisted did not exist for women like her. She had found a partnership of true equals, a love based on respect rather than appearance, a life where her brilliance was celebrated rather than hidden. She had found everything she had been told she did not deserve, and she cherished it with the fierce joy of someone who knew exactly how rare and precious such gifts truly were. And if society still whispered about the unusual marriage between the younger son and the merchant's daughter, Florence no longer heard those whispers. She was too engaged with work that held genuine consequence, too focused on building a life with the one man brave enough to see her true value. It was, she reflected, as she filled another page with precise calculations, exactly the ending she had never dared to dream she might have. Not perfect, perhaps, but real and honest, and built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and genuine love. And for Florence Jane Bancroft Blackwood, That was infinitely better than any elevated match society might have prescribed. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story of intelligence valued over appearance, of courage overcoming social fear, and of love built on true partnership touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope, resilience, and the power of being brave enough to claim what you deserve.